By my understanding, I would say that a hero is someone who cares enough to identify someone else's needs and who's willing to put something of themselves on the line to meaningfully address those needs. In our stories, this might look like Spider-Man or Superman jumping into fights to ensure people's physical safety. In real life, it might look more like a social worker ensuring that a child gets to grow up in a safe environment. We value service to others over fame for ourselves, and love it when someone does good without any expectation of reward. But this isn't the only model of heroism. The ancient Greek idea of heroism differs substantially from this. The ancient Greeks didn't value humility the way we do. Their heroes sometimes served, as in the 12 labors of Hercules. As often as not, they didn't bother with anyone else's needs, as in Odysseus getting nearly his entire army killed on the way home from Troy. Their heroes were not humble, actively tried to build a name for themselves, and worked to be remembered for their deeds. How then does one adapt an ancient Greek story for a modern audience? Madeline Miller has written 3 such adaptations of Homer's The Iliad and the Odyssey and Ovid's Metamorphoses to great success among her contemporary readers. This video argues that her adaptation of the Iliad is successful for 3 reasons. First, she notes the moments where her character's culture does not align with modern sensibilities and describes them in terms that are accessible to her readers. Second, she adjusts Achilles' tragic flaw to make it more interesting to modern readers. Third, she chooses a point of view character, Patroclus, a childhood friend of Achilles and later his lover, who's present for the events of the Trojan War, but who's more palatable to the modern reader than the braggart heroes who drive the plot. Part 1. Ancient Culture. One of the strengths of Miller's writing is that she deftly explains throughout the story all of the most important differences between ancient Greek culture and our own. She employs her main character, Patroclus, as narrator, and as he tells the story of his life, he does it with an awareness that his audience is not overly familiar with the culture in which he lived. For example, he explains that the way his father found out that his mother was a simpleton is that she was happy on her wedding day. This wouldn't make sense to a modern reader because our brides are usually very happy on their wedding days. So he explains that back then, brides did not smile. Similarly, when he and Achilles came home from Pelion, Thetis greets Achilles first, which Patroclus notes as unconventional. Any ancient Greek would know why this was odd, but he explains for the reader that it's proper for a son to greet his father first. Mothers came second, if at all. Miller, through Patroclus, also makes these translations at several points when describing what the Greeks looked for in a hero. On their first night with Odysseus, Achilles and Patroclus are provided one bed, and this causes them some embarrassment because, as Patroclus notes, our men liked conquest. They did not trust a man who was conquered himself. This is a somewhat different hang-up regarding homosexuality than a modern reader might be familiar with. Similarly, once at Troy, Patroclus explains the social connotations of Agamemnon giving the enslaved girl Briseis to Achilles, that the crowd shouted its approval. They liked their commanders generous, their heroes bold and lusty. Modern readers are a little bit more ambivalent about the sexuality of their heroes. On one hand, Captain Kirk, James Bond, and Tony Stark are all sluts, but on the other, Luke Skywalker never married and Captain Picard had very little romance. Sexuality isn't tied to heroism anymore in the same way that Patroclus describes. By giving the readers these cues, Miller invites them to appreciate ancient Greek culture on its own terms where possible. However, not everything has to be explained. Part 2. Achilles' heels. One of the staples of hero stories that has remained consistent in all this time is the idea of the tragic flaw. One can be as rich or powerful or strong or smart or cool as anyone, but they're not perfect. Nobody is. Not even the gods. Anything can be a tragic flaw that leads to one's downfall. Modern examples include Walter White's insecurity and Jay Gatsby's inability to escape the past. In ancient Greek stories, Icarus didn't heed his father's warnings. In another story by Sophocles, Jocasta's flaw was hubris. I can't believe she thought it was a good idea to date younger guys. Hey, I have a son about your age. Should not be your pickup line when you know full well that you're destined to marry your son. It doesn't matter how hot you think Oedipus is. It's not worth it. By contrast, Achilles has weak ankles.
Oh,
Careful.
sorry. Weak ankles.
Okay. Okay, so maybe not all tragic flaws were created equally, but this is the most famous tragic flaw. So much so that we sometimes call someone's tragic flaw their Achilles heel. He's like the Kleenex or the Xerox or the Coke of tragic flaws. Why have a generic tragic flaw when you can have an Achilles heel? Obviously, this isn't particularly compelling for a modern reader, so in Miller's retelling, Achilles' tragic flaw isn't his heel. In fact, she does away entirely with this part of the story where his mother, Thetis, dips him in the Styx to make sure he's impervious to blades, but held on to his ankles so he wouldn't be drawn down the current all the way to Hades. Instead, Miller writes him with beautiful, flawless feet. It's so constant in the narrative, in fact, that one might think Patroclus has a thing for feet. When he first sees Achilles, when they were children, Patroclus describes how he moves easily, his heels flashing pink as licking tongues. When Achilles is taken by his mother to Skyros, Patroclus comments that he doesn't find it odd to find Achilles' shoes left inside, as he often walked around the palace barefooted. As Achilles seeks revenge on Hector, he has to first fight the river god Scamander. At one point in the fight, Achilles loses his footing, and Patroclus said that he thought for a moment that Achilles had really been beaten, only to realize that it had been a feint to trick the god, which he should have known because those feet never stumbled, not once in all the time I knew them. If a mistake came, it would not be there from the delicate bones and the curving arches. A final reference to Achilles' heels comes in the scene where he dies. As Paris knocks the bow, he asks Apollo, "Where do I aim? I heard he was impervious except for..." And Apollo replies, "He's a man, not a god. Shoot him and he will die." In this, Miller recognizes this flaw and pays tribute to it throughout the book, but does not define her Achilles by it. So, if Achilles' heel isn't Achilles' heels, what is it? Because Miller writes her story of ancient heroes for modern audiences, she adjusts their character arcs and narrative arcs to appeal to modern sensibilities. She appropriates some of Achilles' other flaws, like his obsession with honor, and gives them a promotion. Now his tragic flaw is that he's unable to prioritize the things that matter to him. In this retelling, Achilles has two main wants that are, at times, at odds with one another. First, he wants to be remembered. He knows that he will not live long, that he will die at Troy. If he is to be remembered, he needs honor from his deeds and respect from his peers. Second, he wants to be happy, the only hero ever to be happy. For 10 years, he keeps Patroclus safe and rises in everyone's esteem, until Agamemnon claims for himself one of Achilles' war prizes, the slave girl Briseis. Achilles feels that this insult is too great, and he refuses from that point on to fight. The Greeks lose ground until the Trojans begin to light their ships on fire. Patroclus asks Achilles if he might don Achilles' armor to go out in his stead so that the Greeks will be inspired and Achilles' honor spared. Achilles accepts, choosing honor over the safety of his love. This decision, and the subsequent loss of his Philtatos, his most beloved, is what led him to take revenge on Hector, which opened him up to Paris' arrow. For a modern reader, this is much more interesting, so it gets prioritized in the story. In fact, Miller is so skilled in what she does that she addresses this process of retelling and reprioritizing the story within the narrative itself. In their last scene, Odysseus tries to convince Pyrrhus to acknowledge Patroclus on Achilles' grave. Pyrrhus argues that Patroclus would only diminish Achilles' honor, but Odysseus, speaking as the voice of the story, replies, "We cannot say who will survive the Holocaust of memory. Who knows?" he smiles. "Perhaps one day even I will be famous, perhaps more famous than you." "I doubt it." Odysseus shrugs. "We cannot say. We are men only, a brief flare of the torch. Those to come may raise us or lower us as they please. Patroclus may be such as will rise in the future." It is here that our perspective must shift. Achilles is not the main character of this story. The Song of Achilles is narrated by Patroclus. Yet, despite Patroclus' insistence that Achilles' destiny is to be the greatest hero of his generation, Achilles isn't the hero of this story either. The future has come, and Patroclus is the hero. Part 3. Patroclus. Patroclus is not a hero by the ancient Greek standard. He is not a skilled soldier, not a musician, not fast, not strong, doesn't seek to grow his own fame, and he's a man who allowed himself to be conquered. Yet he's perfectly suited to be the hero of a modern retelling of the Iliad because he meets our modern standard of heroism. At the beginning of this video, I stated that my idea of a hero as a modern reader as somebody who cares enough to identify someone else's needs and who's willing to put something of themselves on the line to meaningfully address those needs. Patroclus consistently puts service to others above his own glory. He's humble about his abilities but willing to work hard. His role in the army was not that of a soldier, but of a medic, wherein he saved many soldiers' lives. He made everyone's lives better wherever he could, and he was appreciated for it. He says, "I got to know the men well. Everyone eventually made their way to the medic's tent, if only for smashed toes and ingrown nails." And it was not just the common soldiery. In time I came to know the kings as well. It moved me to know how much they trusted me, turned hopeful faces towards me for comfort. I grew to like them, no matter how difficult they were in council. I developed a reputation, a standing in the camp. I was asked for, known for my quick hands and how little pain I caused. I began to surprise Achilles, calling out to these men as we walked through the camp. I was always gratified at how they would raise a hand in return, point to a scar that had healed over well. Patroclus is loyal to Achilles and to his friends and kind to everyone. When he does take more decisive action, it's to protect others. He's the one who confronted Agamemnon and saved Briseis, whom most of his contemporaries regarded as more of an object than a person. His final grand gesture is to save the Greek army and Achilles' honor by donning Achilles' armor and leading the Myrmidons to battle. He did it anonymously, as many of our modern heroes do, and allowed the outcome of the action to take precedence over the glory associated with it. Patroclus is not Aristosachaion, the best of the Greeks. That's Achilles' title, bestowed on the greatest ancient Greek by ancient Greek standards. Rather, Patroclus was given a different title by Briseis. She calls him best of men, best of the Myrmidons. This title is humbler. It's bestowed not by kings, but by a slave and a woman. It's not official, but an earnest appreciation of what he's done on her behalf, risking himself for her safety. Not just anyone would have done that, and in a culture of boastful men, Patroclus is almost too humble to accept even this praise. He tries to shrug it off, and she insists that he is the best. One can see the best of the Myrmidons as a title given to the greatest hero by the standards of our own time. Conclusion. It can be difficult to adapt a story written with one audience's culture and preferences in mind for another audience with very different sensibilities. Not only are there cultural references that someone not of that culture might miss, but the stories that we tell and want to hear are often those that reflect and affirm our values. The characters and stories that we choose to hear about say a great deal about us, the readers, our expectations, our tastes, and our culture. Miller knew that if her Iliad was to resonate with her readers, it would have to change significantly. The modern reader is a long way off from the illiterate peasant who whiled away an evening hour with the poet who came through town. We want heroes with a sense of honor, loyalty, hard work, humility, and sacrifice, which are traits just as heroic to us as any of Homer's heroes were to his audience. It's fitting, then, that this ancient story for modern times is told from Patroclus' perspective. His heroism was not celebrated in his own time, but he, as Miller writes him, appeals to us.